The year was 1878, and Savannah was heavy with rain and rumour. The cobblestones glistened like wet ink beneath the gas lamps, and the river carried a slow, restless current that smelled faintly of salt and decay. In the oldest quarter of the city, where magnolia trees leaned over iron fences and shutters whispered against cracked windows, there stood a house that everyone knew but no one dared to visit. Its owner, Margaret Vance, was a widow of some wealth and reputation, a woman wrapped in mourning silk and a silence she mistook for dignity. But silence, in Savannah, had a way of becoming its own kind of noise. Each evening, as the last light faded across Whitaker Street, a faint laughter could be heard spilling from the parlor windows, a brittle, deliberate laughter that did not sound like joy. The servants said it was the widow's way of chasing away a ghost. Others whispered that she laughed not at the haunting but with it, for in that house, tragedy had soaked into the floorboards. Only months before, Margaret's maid, Clara Bell, had drowned in the cistern behind the property. A quiet death that came without witnesses, without a cry. The newspapers called it an accident, the neighbours called it punishment, and Margaret called it nothing at all. Inside the house, time seemed trapped in amber. The curtains were drawn too tight, shutting out the world as if daylight itself were an accusation. Dust clung to the portraits in the hallway, and every clock ticked just a second too slow, as if hesitating to move forward. Margaret's parlour was her stage. Velvet chairs, a dying fire, and a mirror that hung crooked above the mantel, cracked through its centre like a lightning scar. That was where she sat each night, staring at her reflection as though it was someone else's face, then laughing, sharp, sudden, and hollow. It was a laugh that sounded like it had been rehearsed, as if she needed to prove to herself that she was still alive. The servants had grown fearful. Some refused to clean the parlour. One claimed to hear dripping water long after the rain had stopped. Another said the mirror fogged over even in the heat, like someone's breath was trapped inside it. When they brought her meals, Margaret would smile too wide and say, "She visits me now. The maid, she stands behind me when I look away." They would nod terrified and leave quickly, whispering prayers as they crossed the threshold. The widow's grief had curdled into something unnatural, something almost mocking. But Margaret had not always been cruel. There was a time when the house rang with music and the clinking of glasses, when her husband's laughter filled the hall. That was before the fever took him, before debt turned her generous nature into suspicion. Clara Bell had come to her then, a young woman of quiet strength, intelligent eyes, and hands that knew how to steady a trembling world. She kept Margaret's house when the widow could not keep her mind. And yet, as so often happens when power sits across from poverty, familiarity bred resentment. Margaret began to imagine judgment in the girl's silence, defiance in her gaze. It was said that on the night of Clara's death, the two had quarrelled. Ledger had gone missing, one that contained accounts from Margaret's late husband's business, dealings. Clara had seen something she wasn't meant to see. No, one knows what words were spoken in that parlour before the rain came down. But by morning the maid's body was found in the cistern, her hair tangled in the weeds, her face pale as candle wax. The widow wept in public, fainted at the coroner's words, and wore black from that day forward. But behind closed doors, the laughter began. Weeks turned to months. The laughter persisted, always at night, always beneath the mirror's fractured gaze. Some said Margaret's mind had broken under the strain. Others believed the ghost had taken residence in her reflection, forcing the widow to relive her sin each evening, until the mirror decided otherwise. It wasn't until the winter came, when frost crept across the panes and the house began to truly rot, that the letter arrived. It was delivered by a boy who did not stay for payment. The envelope was thin, the paper rough as if it had travelled far. Margaret read it alone by lamplight, her eyes trembling over each uneven line. The handwriting was familiar in shape, but unsteady in spirit. It belonged to Clara's sister, a seamstress from across the river. The words were simple, unadorned, and cruel in their precision. "You laughed at her death, but the mirror will show you what you buried." The lamp flickered. Margaret's breath caught. For a moment, she thought she heard footsteps behind her, slow and wet, crossing the parlour floor. She turned toward the mirror. The crack down its centre seemed deeper now, splitting her reflection into two faces, one alive, one shadowed. She whispered her own name as if reminding the glass who she was, but the face in the mirror did not move with her. That night, no laughter echoed through the house, only the sound of dripping water, steady and patient, like the heartbeat of something that refused to die. Morning found her seated exactly where she had been, upright, eyes open, lips parted in a half-smile that looked almost human. The servants dared not touch her. The doctor called it heart failure. The priest called it divine justice. And though the house was silent now, the mirror stayed on the wall, cracked but whole enough to keep what it had taken. Over the next weeks, strange things were reported. The cistern, once sealed, began to collect water even when the skies were dry. At night, passers-by swore they saw candlelight flickering behind the parlor curtains, though the house had been shuttered, and the neighbors said that if you stood close enough to the gate, you could still hear faint laughter, not joyous but brittle and broken, like glass being swept from a floor. They buried Margaret beside her husband. Though the groundkeeper claimed the earth refused to settle, the priest insisted on blessing the grave twice, murmuring that some souls must be told where to rest. As for the letter, it vanished from the table before the servants could hand it to the authorities. Some say it was burned with the widow's belongings. Others say it was never meant for human eyes at all, that it had been written by a hand that was not entirely of this world. Years later, when new tenants moved into the house, they complained of water stains reappearing no matter how often they cleaned. The parlor mirror, though polished, seemed always dimmed, as if something on the other side refused to let light through. One woman claimed she could hear whispering when she stood before it too long, the faint suggestion of laughter beneath a woman's sobs. The mirror was eventually taken down and stored in the attic, but the stains on the wall beneath it remained, a ghostly outline of where it once hung. Those who study the old records say Margaret Vance was a woman haunted not by the dead, but by her own reflection, that her laughter was not defiance, but desperation, the sound of someone trying to outpace guilt in the end. Even she must have realized that laughter cannot drown out silence. It only makes the echo louder. And so, in the fading rooms of that house on Whitaker Street, the story lingered, not in the walls but in the air itself. Heavy and moist like the breath of the river, the mirror remained cracked. The cistern filled and emptied with the seasons, and the city went on pretending not to remember. But Savannah keeps its memories close, beneath every magnolia root and every piece of crumbling plaster. History hums, quiet, persistent, unwilling to be forgotten. When night falls and the rain begins to tap against the glass, locals still cross the street to avoid that corner. They say if you listen closely, you can hear laughter carried through the damp air. Laughter that begins as a woman's and ends as something else entirely. A reminder that truth, once submerged, has a way of resurfacing, and that some mirrors do not reflect faces and they reveal them, because in Savannah, 1878, a widow once laughed at her maid's ghost, but in the end, it was the mirror that laughed last. Some names only find peace once the truth is spoken. Injustice in Savannah did not enter the room with a shout. It slipped in with cologne and polished shoes. It smiled, signed the guest book, and took a velvet chair by the fire. That was how it worked in Margaret Vance's circle, where charity was a ribbon tied around a debt, and grief was a performance for Sunday pews. People said Margaret had earned her mourning, a widow alone, holding up a grand house while the vines pulled at the brick. But the house did not live on sorrow. It lived on the cotton that built it, on the sweat that never got counted, on the names that were only whispers in a back room. Her late husband's empire was clean on paper, dirty anywhere else. Ledgers made it look like balance, but the pages carried a bruise. Clara Bell saw that bruise. She saw it when she dusted the study and felt the rough leather of those books under her fingers. She saw it when the light hit the ink and the letters shone like oil upon water. She could read the columns. She understood the notations. She knew what a dash meant where wages should be. She knew what settled meant when a person had not been paid. She saw names crossed out and corrected with a number that was lower each time. She did not speak at first. She moved through the house like a tide. Quiet, regular, inevitable. The widow began to watch her. Margaret felt a chill whenever Clara paused near the desk, as if the space around the girl had thinned and the house had leaned in to listen. It is easy to say that the maid did not know her place. It is harder to admit that the widow had built her place on a lie, and the floor under it had begun to rot. In that summer, people stayed on porches until dusk and told stories to keep the heat at bay. They spoke of storms and fortunes and sudden fevers. They spoke of the Vance house too, but softly, like they were afraid of waking it. Neighbors began to notice small things. A pair of shoes outside the parlor door when the lamp inside was still burning. 2 voices where one should be. One evening, the cobbler's boy swore he heard a woman scream. It was a sharp sound, and then it cut off as if a hand had pressed over it. After that came laughter. Thin, glassy, a sound that did not belong to happiness. The boy stayed very still on the corner and counted his breaths. He said later that the laughter bent like light around a bottle and made his teeth ache. The coroner lived 3 streets away. He was a tall man with a limp and a taste for brandy. He knew Margaret's husband. He knew the accounts and the favors. When Clara was found in the cistern, the coroner came in his evening coat and did not meet anyone's eyes for long. He said the right words. He wrote the right lines. He told the sheriff there was no bruise where a bruise should be. He kept his hands very clean. They drank together after the papers were signed. In the quiet between sips, something inside the house shifted, like a person turning over in sleep. The coroner glanced at the parlor and asked if the mirror had always been cracked. Margaret said yes. She lied. He did not push. That is how injustice does its work, not with a knife but with a nod. In the mornings that followed, the yard smelled of wet stone. The cistern was drained. In the bottom, silt held small secrets, a button, a pin, a ribbon of black silk that did not belong to the dead. It lay there like a thin smile. A few women from the lane came to look and crossed themselves without meaning to. The men said, "Close it up," and said nothing else. The ribbon disappeared before any officer could take it. In the kitchen, the maids held their aprons and stared at the pots until the water boiled dry. The cook whispered that the house was breathing wrong, like it could not catch air. That was when the ledgers vanished. Smoke has a smell even when windows are open. It clings to velvet and hair. It haunts a dress for years. The servants still remember standing at the edge of the lawn as Margaret fed the fire in the iron drum. She burned the books one by one. She held each ledger as if it were a sin that had to pass through her hands before it could be forgiven. The edges turned red, then black, and then a scatter of ash drifted over the box hedge and fell on the grass like grey snow. She kept her eyes steady. No flinching. A woman washing a stain, but paper screams as it dies. It crackles like bones. It begs in its own language. The cook said she heard the pages crying. No one laughed then. No one said a word. Margaret paid in other ways. Gifts to the church, coin to a policeman's wife, a basket to the grieving sister who would not come to the door. The city smiled back. The city has always known how to fold scandal into prayer, but money does not stick to silence for long. Heat and time peel it back. By late summer, the parlor felt thick. The air held damp where no damp should be. Floorboards swelled at the edge, making chairs tilt, making candles lean. The mirror on the mantel turned stranger. It gathered a film that hands could not wipe away. It tarnished from the inside, as if breath collected there and would not leave. Margaret no longer received callers. She moved through the corridors like a narrow ship, skirts brushing past the walls, eyes searching for drafts that did not exist. In the night the house spoke, not with voices, with a slow hollow sound beneath the rugs. A groan where wood met nail, the weight of something that did not sleep. She told the maids to seal the parlor. Hammer the door, cover the keyhole with wax. She said the mirror had begun to breathe. She said it fogged when she walked by, even with no fire and no lamp and no living soul to warm the air. The servants obeyed. They closed the room with boards and black cloth. They tacked the seams like a shroud. The house did not thank them. It shivered and settled and kept the new shape like a body that has learned to carry pain. Still, some afternoons, if you passed the window, you could see a tremor in the curtain, a slight pulling as if the parlor were taking in air. The neighbors noted the widow's steps in the garden growing shorter. She seemed to lose inches each week. She wore her grief like armor and walked the paths again and again, making grooves where the earth showed through. Children played a game at the gate. They held their breath and counted to 13. When one ran out of air, the others said the house had stolen it. The game spread down the block. Mothers told them to stop. Children know when a story is true. One morning a market woman came to the back door and spoke to the laundress. She had seen a thing, she said, in the alley, late at night, a small shape spilling water as it moved, slipping along the fence like a shadow that had come loose. It was not a person, she said. It was the idea of a person. The laundress shut the door and placed a jug of salt by the threshold. Habit is a kind of prayer. It can hold off dread as well as any hymn, and yet dread grew. It grew in the pantry, where the jams began to mold before their time. It grew in the study, where the ink never dried right and smudged into little clouds. It grew on the back staircase, where a sag in the wood made each step a question. Margaret told herself that a good woman keeps a good house and a good story. She pressed flowers between heavy books, as if to flatten the past. She lit candles and watched the wicks bloom and die. She held the last ledger she had not burned, the small private one that had notes in her own hand, and put it in a drawer she locked with a ribbon. She slept with the key under her pillow and woke with the imprint on her cheek. The coroner visited once more. He was thinner. The limp was worse. He stood on the porch with his hat in his hands, turning the brim as if he could wring a truth from it. He asked if she was well. She said yes. He said the city was talking. She said the city always talks. He asked if the maid had any family left. She looked at the iron fence while he spoke, and watched a moth wear itself out against the spear point. When he had gone, she wiped the rail with a cloth as if he had left a stain. That evening, a storm came up from the river without warning. Rain struck the roof like thrown gravel. The sealed parlor began to hum with a low sound, steady as breath. Boards flexed. Nails signed their complaint. The cloth over the door pulsed inward and outward. Margaret stood in the hall with a candle and felt her lungs follow that rhythm. Something large and patient waited on the other side, counting with her. The cistern filled and overflowed. Water ran across the yard and along the foundation. It hissed into the cracks and found the spaces under the floor. She thought the house might float. She thought it might tear loose and drift toward the river like a barge of brick and grief. She stood there until the candle died. After the storm, the air tasted of iron. The next day, the cook found the black silk ribbon on the pantry floor, coiled like a question mark. Everyone said they did not place it there. Everyone stepped around it. No one touched it. The clock in the hallway began to lose time. 5 minutes a day, then 10. It tried to stop at the exact hour when the boy had heard the scream. Twice a week the hands stuck there, as if they had reached a shore and refused to leave it. That hour sat in the house like a cold plate left on a table. It invited flies that never came. Margaret sent for the carpenter. He pried at the parlor boards and frowned. The wood felt soft. It sounded hollow when he tapped it. He said he would return tomorrow with better tools. He did not. He fell from his ladder that afternoon on another job and broke his arm clean through. The next carpenter declined the work. The third asked too many questions, and the door closed before he finished them. At church, the sermon pressed on repentance. The widow kept her hands still in her lap and did not kneel. She watched the candlesticks and their twin flames, one straight, one guttering. She thought of the mirror breathing like a lung. She thought of the letter that had said, "The mirror will show you what you buried." She had not answered that letter. She had no words for it. She had only her laughter, which had gone missing, and her quiet, which had now become a sound that filled the rooms. Silence aged poorly. It grew a skin and a smell. It wore a face. In the harvest months, the house felt crowded, though few people entered it. You could sense another presence if you set your palm on the wall. A faint vibration like a murmured name. The maids kept their eyes down and their minds on their work. Names were a risk. Names could call things closer. But there are names that call themselves. On a late afternoon, when the sky held a color like bruised peach, Margaret paused at the sealed parlor door and placed her ear to the cloth. She heard nothing at first. Then she heard a small sound. Not a voice. Not a knock. A breath drawn in. Let out. Drawn in again. No rush, no panic. As regular as the tide. She kept listening until she matched it without meaning to. In and out. In and out. Air met air on either side of the wood. The seam between worlds thinned like paper touched by oil. She took a step back. The cloth at the keyhole fluttered. Dust lifted as if the door had sighed. She stood there very straight and smoothed her skirt. She did not speak. There are things a person cannot say to a door. The house settled. The breath continued. Somewhere under the floor, water shifted and found a new path. The scent of damp rose like a thought you cannot push away. She felt it then. The true weight, the honest weight, the kind that splinters joists and bends iron nails. It was not the house pressing down. It was what the house remembered. And the parlor remembered everything. She counted 3 breaths more, then turned and walked toward the stairs with a hand on the rail to steady herself, hearing the echo of that slow inhale behind her, wondering how long a house can hold a secret before it speaks it out loud. The truth does not arrive with thunder. It comes quietly, like dust settling after a storm, invisible until the light finds it. 10 years had passed since the laughter in the parlor had last been heard. By then, the Vance house had changed hands twice. Paint had peeled, shutters had fallen, and vines had made a slow claim over the balcony rail. The street around it had softened with time. Children now played where carriages once rattled, and most of Savannah had convinced itself the old stories were only that, stories. But memory has its own persistence. It waits, and it remembers what people choose to forget. In 1888, a man named Samuel Fletcher bought the house. He was a tradesman with ambition, practical by nature and proud of his progress. He didn't believe in spirits or curses. He believed in carpentry and sunlight, and the way a hammer's echo can drive ghosts out of corners. When he walked through the house for the first time, the agent mentioned quietly that it had been empty for some years. Samuel didn't ask why. He saw potential where others saw decay. His wife saw something else. She said the air in the parlor felt wrong, that it moved even when the windows were closed. Samuel laughed and said the place only needed new plaster. Renovations began that summer. The workmen started in the parlor, where the boards had warped and the wallpaper peeled like skin from a wound. They stripped the room bare, pulling nails from the floor, tearing down panels that had been sealed long ago. The first strike of a crowbar brought a cloud of dust so thick that one man coughed blood. Behind the wall, wrapped in linen gone yellow with age, they found a mirror. It was heavy, larger than a man, its frame carved with ivy leaves and strange symbols that might have been decorative once, but now looked like they had grown there on their own. When they peeled away the cloth, the glass beneath was dark and dull. The silver backing cracked in a way that made the surface look alive. At first glance, it was only a relic, but when they lifted it into the light, the air shifted. One worker swore he saw movement beneath the tarnish, like water trembling before rain. Another said he saw 2 faces instead of one, both female, both blurred, both watching. They set it down quickly. When the foreman brushed away the last of the dust from its back, he noticed faint scratches. Letters, shallow but deliberate, etched by a hand that knew what it wanted to say, even as it shook. The words, when traced, read, "She pushed me for knowing what was hers to confess." Silence filled the room after that. Even the hammers outside seemed to hesitate. The men looked at each other, each waiting for someone to laugh, to call it a prank. No one did. The foreman ordered the mirror covered again, but no one would touch it. Samuel, when told, dismissed the story as superstition. He said people carve nonsense all the time. Still, he sent the mirror to the attic instead of the rubbish pile. That night his wife heard footsteps pacing above them, long after everyone had gone to bed. The following days grew strange. Paint refused to dry in the parlor. Tools went missing and reappeared at odd angles, their metal cold as if left outdoors in winter. The foreman left the job without a word. His crew followed the next morning. Only Samuel remained certain it was imagination, that old stories cling to old wood, and once the house was filled with life again, all this nonsense would fade. But the house seemed to listen to him when he said that, as though waiting for him to finish his sentence. Weeks later, a local historian, curious about the house's reputation, came to visit. He had a habit of collecting small tragedies, keeping them safe in notes and church records. He spoke of the widow, Margaret Vance, and the maid who drowned in the cistern behind the garden wall. He said the story ended without justice, that the coroner had written accidental fall, though everyone knew better. He carried a small notebook of his own findings, statements, rumors, a copy of a parish ledger from St. Augustine's. In its margin, written in a slanting hand, was a fragment believed to be the widow's last confession. It read, "I laughed because I feared her silence more than I feared God." No one knew who she had written it to. The letter had been tucked between donations and funeral accounts, folded as though it were never meant to be found. The ink had bled through the paper in small black rivers. The historian read the line aloud, softly, almost reverently. Samuel's wife crossed herself without realizing it. The room seemed to darken as if the house had inhaled. That evening, Samuel went to the attic. He had grown weary of whispers and wanted to see the mirror himself. The linen was still there, damp now at the edges, though the roof did not leak. When he pulled it away, he saw his own reflection, split down the center by a vein of silver rot. But the longer he looked, the less sure he was that it was his face at all. The left half smiled faintly. The right seemed to weep. He stepped back, breathing through his teeth. Something behind the glass seemed to move, a pale ripple, slow as breath. He reached out a hand and felt warmth where the surface should have been cold. Then he heard it, a sound like water rising through wood, a faint echo of laughter stretched thin. He dropped the cloth and left the attic without closing the door. By morning, his wife found him outside by the cistern, staring into the water. The reflection of the house swam in the surface, distorted by leaves and rain. He said the mirror was alive. She said nothing. Some truths cannot be corrected once spoken aloud. The next week, she packed her belongings and left for her sister's home in Macon. Samuel stayed. He said he had invested too much to leave now. Neighbors noticed he began keeping candles lit through the night. They flickered behind the parlor windows, sometimes two, sometimes one, sometimes none at all. On foggy mornings, he was seen digging near the garden wall, though no one dared ask what he sought. When the historian returned months later, the house was empty again. The door hung open. Dust lay thick across the floors, but there were footprints, wet ones leading from the parlor to the attic stairs and then stopping halfway up. The mirror was still there, uncovered. Its surface had grown darker, but in certain light you could see two figures, one upright, one inverted, meeting at the crack like the edge of a coin. It is said the church refused to take the mirror. They called it cursed. So it remained, silent and heavy, until the house passed again into the city's hands. Workmen sealed the attic door. A new roof went up. Years drifted by. Today, those who work at the museum that now stands on Whitaker Street say the parlor mirror hangs behind velvet rope. They say the glass still bears the faint scratch marks, though time has softened them. Visitors lean close, looking for the message. Most can't see it. A few step back quickly, claiming they saw something else, a shadow or a face that blinked. The archivist keeps the widow's letter locked in a drawer. Sometimes when she works late, she reads it again under the low light of a green-shaded lamp, the ink brown and faded like dried blood. I laughed because I feared her silence more than I feared God. The words seem to breathe. They sound almost human when spoken aloud, and in the quiet afterward, if one listens very closely, the old house seems to respond. A sigh through its walls, a creak beneath its floors. A single drop of water hitting stone. The truth came quietly, as it always does. It didn't shout. It whispered through wood and silver and paper. It waited until the right eyes were brave or foolish enough to look. And when they did, it showed them everything. The guilt, the silence, the breath that never left the room. The mirror remains. The names have faded, but the reflection is still waiting, half in shadow. Half in light, two women bound by one secret, watching through the years for someone to see them. The house still stands, but the silence feels heavier now. Time is not kind, but it is patient. It softens paint, dulls brass, and bleaches voices until only whispers remain. Yet even time cannot smooth the memory of a house that refuses to forget. On Whitaker Street, beneath the hush of the Spanish, moss and the slow hum of cicadas, the Vance house still stands. Its brickwork leans slightly now, its porch boards creak when no one steps upon them, and ivy wraps the columns like a hand that never lets go. They say every house remembers something, but this one remembers everything. It remembers the laughter that was not joy. It remembers the silence that followed. It remembers the weight of water and the glint of glass. By the turn of the new century, Savannah had changed her clothes. The grand carriages were gone, and the streets smelled less of magnolia and more of coal smoke. People hurried now. The city's past was being sold in neat pieces: furniture, lace, letters, and land. The Vance estate, long empty and unclaimed, was bought cheap by a widow from Charleston who saw opportunity where others saw bad luck. She turned the place into a boarding home for traveling clerks and widowed schoolteachers. She told them the ghost stories were foolish talk, and perhaps they were. Until the first winter came. One tenant, a teacher named Miss Avery, was the first to notice it. She told her neighbor she woke one night to the sound of dripping water. It wasn't from the ceiling. It was steady, like a clock, and it came from the parlor below. When she went down with a lamp, the floorboards were dry, but there were footprints, bare, small, leading from the stair to the old mirror that hung in the corner. The prints ended there just before the glass. She said she saw a shape in it then, not herself, but something leaning close as though listening. The landlord blamed the damp. She scrubbed the floors and hung herbs by the lintel, but the scent of water never left. The mirror, which she had been told was part of the house, could not be moved. 2 men tried once, and the rope snapped like a whip. They left it where it was. At night, it darkened under candlelight, not shadow, but color, like old silver turning to storm. When they looked into it, they said the reflection seemed late, as if arriving from another time. Years blurred. The boarding home became a parlor house, then a storage space, then, after a fire damaged the street, an office for a preservation society. The mirror survived all of it. By the 1930s, the building was deemed of historical interest. Volunteers swept the ashes, repainted the walls, and opened the doors again, this time as a museum. The Vance House, a glimpse into Savannah's Gilded Age. The guide pamphlet spoke of heritage and architecture, and the cotton empire that built the South. It did not speak of Clara Bell. It did not speak of the cistern or the letter that burned. But stories are clever things. They slip between pages. They wait. Visitors began to feel something the pamphlets didn't print. Some said they smelled river water near the parlor even in dry months. Others heard laughter, thin, cracking, as though pulled from an old record. Once a child claimed she saw the lady in the glass. When asked to describe her, she said, "She's not smiling yet." In 1947, a local historian named Ruth Hale came to the museum to research plantation records. She was not from Savannah, and she did not know the rumors. She spent hours in the attic archives, where the air was thick and the past lay folded in boxes. It was there she found a small collection of papers bound with a rusted pin. The label read, "House Accounts 1876-1878. Inside were budget notes written in 2 distinct hands, one flowing, one careful. The careful one signed her name only once, Clara Bell. Ruth noticed a page torn from the middle. The remaining sheets carried more than numbers. There were small lines of hymns, words rewritten in margins, and a faint sketch of a woman standing before a mirror, her face unfinished. Ruth pressed her palm over the page. The paper was brittle, but she could feel something in it, like warmth or breath. She copied what she could, then sealed the papers back where she found them. That night, she stayed late to finish her notes. The wind rose off the river, pushing through the broken shutters. Somewhere downstairs, a door closed softly. She thought she was alone until she heard it, the faint scrape of a chair on wood. Then laughter. Quiet, not mocking this time, but almost fragile, the sound of someone trying to remember how to be alive. Ruth descended the stairs with her lamp shaking in her hand. The parlor was dark except for the candle by the mirror. Its flame bent as though under a breath. And in the reflection, she saw what she would later refuse to describe. 2 women, standing close, their faces blurred by the same curve of silver, one alive, one drowned, both waiting. Ruth did not tell anyone what she saw. She locked the door behind her and mailed the copies of Clara's notes to the Historical Society in Charleston, where they would be catalogued under Unidentified Domestic Servant, Savannah, 19th Century. But she never stopped thinking about that line in the margin. She pushed me for knowing what was hers to confess. Over time, the museum became proud of its hauntings. Guides began to tell stories, half-truths wrapped in charm. They said a widow once laughed herself mad. They said her mirror breathed. They said her servant forgave her at last. None of it was entirely true, none of it was entirely false, But stories like that have a way of feeding themselves, growing stronger with each retelling, until what was once grief becomes performance. Yet sometimes, when the guides closed up for the night, they would find water pooling near the baseboards. No leaks, no rain, just a small, perfect circle of damp that vanished by morning. The years kept rolling. New caretakers, new paint, new words for old things. The mirror stayed. Every attempt to move it ended in accidents, a broken ankle, a shattered frame, a sudden sickness. So it remained in its corner, covered by a thin muslin sheet when not on display. Some nights, even covered, it dimmed the light around it. Staff learned not to touch the cloth after dark. A generation later, restoration work uncovered something behind the plaster in the upstairs hall, a letter folded within the wall itself. The ink was faded, the words barely legible, but the handwriting was the widow's. I laughed because I feared her silence more than I feared God. That letter, like the mirror, was left in the house. Visitors today can see both, the note framed on the wall, the mirror roped off nearby. They don't always connect them. They walk past, talking about design, about craftsmanship, about tragedy softened by time. But every so often, someone stops. They tilt their head. They look longer than they meant to. They swear the glass shifts, darkens, as though something inside it stirs awake. Some say Clara found peace through the telling, that every voice that speaks her name pulls her closer to rest. Others believe Margaret still lingers, her laughter worn to a whisper, begging forgiveness she never earned. On quiet nights, when the wind moves through the hallway, it carries a faint sound. It's not weeping, not quite laughter either. Something between the two, breaking softly like water over stone. The guides tell each other it's the building settling. The janitor says it's the sea. But those who've stood alone in that parlor know better. The house breathes, it remembers. It keeps the shape of every secret ever spoken within its walls. The mirror waits, patient as truth, its silver darkened by a century of eyes. And in its depths, if the candle burns just right, you might catch the faintest reflection of two women, one holding guilt, one holding grace. The tour ends there now. The guide thanks the guests, the doors close, the lights dim. And as the last footsteps fade down the porch steps, the silence gathers itself again, wrapping the rooms like fog. In Savannah, they say history has a long memory. It clings to houses, to mirrors, to names whispered too late. The Vance house still stands, but the silence inside it feels heavier now. Some names only find peace when the truth is told.